So it looks like we have a pretty good number of folks who've joined us. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Mark Crenshaw, and I'm a member of the AUCD Leadership Academy faculty. And my main job today is to introduce to you Matthew Wesley Williams, who's going to lead us through the webinar today titled Courage and Renewal, Resources for Authentic Leadership. Matthew is the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at the Fund for Theological Exploration here in Atlanta. And he led us through the facilitated our 2017 Leadership Academy. And so grateful to have you with us today, Matthew, and grateful that you'll be back with us for the Academy in a couple of weeks. So welcome.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. And I'm also grateful to be included in this important work and to have the privilege of holding and facilitating this Leadership Academy in a few weeks. So we're almost there, and we're looking forward to it. Like Mark said, my name is Matthew Wesley Williams. I'm Vice President of Strategic Initiatives with the Forum for Theological Exploration. I also operate a consulting practice called Liberating Leadership. And again, I'll be principally facilitating much of the week for the Leadership Academy. So welcome. And I'm glad to be with you for this third pre-learning webinar. And we'll be focusing for the next hour on an approach to convening and facilitation that will shape much of our time together. It will be the kind of container that in which we convene and build authentic leadership together. And that container we're calling broadly Courage and Renewal, Resources for Authentic Leadership. So the design of the Leadership Academy is based on the idea that one of the most important interventions that change-making leaders, like those of us who will gather together in a few weeks, can make is with ourselves, right? In as much as we're trying to change systems and structures and we are building movements for change, the principal and most important change that we can make is really with ourselves. So that a leader's self-awareness and our ability to lead with authenticity and with integrity is really tied to our ability to lead change, right? In organizations, communities, and larger systems. So let's move to the content of today's webinar. And what we want to do today is, for the next hour, talk about what we'll do for the next hour. So what we want to do today is name the learning objectives for the AUCD Leadership Academy. Learn a little bit about the Center for Courage and Renewal and the Circles of Trust approach that, again, will shape the container for our gathering. And then highlight complementary methodologies that'll also help to build out this experience for us. And then review the arc of the week and some next steps and that we can take in preparation for our time together. So here are the objectives for our time together. We will be in a 6-day experience together that has 4 primary objectives. Number 1 is to gain insight into the history of the disability and civil rights movements. And in light of that history, to begin to locate ourselves or our organizations within the disability and civil rights movements. Then we want to explore strategies together for working within and across systems using collective impact as a model. And then finally gain insight into our role, into the role of self-awareness and reflection in the practice of leadership. So those are our 4 objectives for our time together. So to start, let me introduce you to the Center for Courage and Renewal and the Circles of Trust approach. The Center for Courage and Renewal was founded in 1997 as the Center for Teacher Formation. And its mission is to create a more just, compassionate, and healthy world by nurturing personal and professional integrity and the courage to act on it. It was founded in 1997 with a focus on teachers. In fact, the name was the Center for Teacher Formation. And the folks that you see pictured here are the three founders. It was founded really to help sustain teachers in the hard work of teaching, primarily working with folks in the K through 12 sector. As you know, teachers are often in stressed and broken systems. And the question that was guiding their work was, how do we help these professionals reconnect with their sense of calling and purpose and renew their passion for teaching the whole student? And you see much of that work, much of the beginnings of the thinking, the theory, and the practice that went into that early work in one of Parker Palmer's books, which is called The Courage to Teach. And so what the Center for Courage and Renewal does is it really builds leadership capacity to lead and act with courage in pursuit of one's deepest convictions and true calling. It builds our capacity to develop trustworthy relationships among others who we work with and alongside. It helps us to cultivate practices that sustain us and inspire others for meaningful work, not just for the short term, but for the long haul. And it builds our capacity to work together, to transform the institutions and the systems that these institutions serve. And working together and building relationship creates a kind of durable set of relationships from which those long-term changes can unfold. So that's what the Center for Courage and Renewal does. And its core approach is called a circle of trust. So this signature approach is designed to create space for leaders to align who they are with what they do. It's an approach to leadership development and personal discernment and even discovery. Much of the approach is really given away in one of Parker Palmer's books, which is called A Hidden Wholeness, The Journey to an Undivided Life. He says in that book, if we are willing to embrace the challenge of becoming whole, we cannot embrace it alone, at least not for long. We need trustworthy relationships to sustain us, tenacious communities of support to sustain the journey toward an undivided life. And so taking an inner journey toward rejoining soul and role requires a rare but real form of community that we call a circle of trust. And so this undivided life is what he talks about in terms of connecting really who you are with what you do. And the circles of trust approach that you see pictured here is an approach that fosters that kind of alignment. It supports many of the disciplines that we talk about in organizational development in terms of learning organizations. Peter Senge, in his book, The Fifth Discipline, talks about the discipline of mental models being a reflective practice in which leaders and the organizations that they work in surface the unexamined assumptions that are driving our activity, such that we can make choices about the values and the deeply held beliefs that actually drive our action in the world. So it supports leadership disciplines like mental models and reflective practice and the work of reflective practitioners who are as active, who are really attempting to be as articulate in their work and about their work as they are active in their work. So these leadership disciplines are really cultivated through circles of trust and other kinds of similar methodologies. It also builds on an insight that came from, or fosters really an insight that came from a CEO of an insurance company, Hanover Insurance, Bill O'Brien, who in a work by organizational theorist Otto Scharmer talked about what he learned through similar processes. He said he learned that any change-making leader recognizes that the success of their intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. So again, he draws this connection between one's inner life, inner quality, their reflective practice, and their outer work in the world. So circles of trust is an approach that leverages a discipline of principles and practices that enable our shared exploration of core identity in a group setting, an exploration of formative experiences and our deeply held commitments to inform really our action in the world. So the circles of trust is driven by a set of principles and practices. Again, that rests on the idea that our public work rests on deep inner convictions that require inner clarity and courage to articulate our inner values and act on them. And so what these principles and practices are set to do, are designed to do, and I should say they've been crafted over a long period of time through a community of practice that has really been thinking together about how do we create the conditions for people to take a journey inward and to begin to engage, and in some cases even confront their inner selves, again, to inform their outer work. And so these 7 principles really hold together the work of the Circles of Trust in the Center for Courage and Renewal. One is that everyone has an inner teacher. The second is that inner work, and the kind of work that this is designed to facilitate, requires both solitude, but also requires community, right? Enriched by dialogue and being heard by others into deeper speech. The third one is that inner work, that inner journey that we talked about, must be invitational. No one can force you or coerce you into doing this kind of work. So that's a very, very important principle that holds all of this together. Fourth is that our lives, like the cycles of the natural world, move in seasons. And so much of the work of the Center for Courage and Renewal pays attention to the seasons of our lives, even as they sometimes correspond with the seasons of natural life. Number 5 is that we appreciate paradox and recognize and hold complexity. I like to say people are complicated and human communities are that much more complicated. And so we appreciate paradox and really affirm the ways in which paradox enrich our lives and help us to hold greater complexity in the systems that we operate in. Number 6, we live with greater integrity, and when we see ourselves whole and have the space to notice and to attend to the whole of ourselves, not just many of the parts of ourselves that sometimes are welcome while other parts of ourselves are not welcome in the spaces that we inhabit in our work and life. And finally, really kind of leading on that 6th one, is that there is a hidden wholeness that underlies all of our lives, where the whole of ourselves really makes up a kind of gestalt that is so much greater than the sum of the parts of ourselves. So these practices are the kinds of disciplines, I would say, that in a circle of trust, that create the kind of space that gives folks the permission and the safety to take the kind of journey that is not likely to happen otherwise, right? And so these practices, and we'll come back to many of these, we often talk about in some ways as touchstones. And you'll see more, we'll talk about more of that when we get together and we begin to set some of the ground rules for how we'll engage one another and show up during the Leadership Academy. But the practices of the Circles of Trust approach are these, that we create open, hospitable space, right? And that in that space, if we are to create space for people to take an inward journey, we don't do the fixing of others for them, right? We don't try to save one another from the reckoning that most of us do when we take that inward journey. But because we are a community, we're coming together as a community of leaders to really engage with our own inner lives in the community of others. Our primary work is not to fix other people, but to really look inward into our own lives. So we commit to no fixing, advising, and saving one another. Then we also have a practice of asking open, honest questions, which seems on its face fairly simple. But what people tend to notice is that open, honest questions are countercultural and also difficult to ask, because we're used to asking leading questions and other kinds of questions that sometimes we know the answer to even before we ask it. But open, honest questions are questions that are designed to help others gain more access to their own inner lives. Open-ended questions that we sometimes call self-awakening questions that give people access and the gift of more clarity about what's happening inside their own minds and hearts. So fourth, we operate at this intersection between the universal and particular. So we explore universal stories of human experience through personal storytelling. So this is the idea that you can't really get to the universal except by way of the particular. And so we start with the personal stories of our lives as a way of drawing out universal themes. That intersection is very important. We also operate with multiple modes of reflection. We all learn differently, we engage material differently, we walk through the world differently. And so having different ways to engage material and reflect is important so that all of us have access to this kind of experience. And then finally, because so much of this work is happening in inviting us to engage in deeply, deeply personal reflection, many of the stories that are shared and the insights that pop up require a deep confidentiality. And so we honor confidentiality as a kind of sacred vow where we really hold one another's safety by ensuring one another that we do not have permission to go outside of this space and to share stories without the permission of the storyteller. And in many cases, it's important to not even think that we have the permission to go back to the storyteller after they've told that story, as though they've invited us into being their therapist or something. Well, that's not what this is for. So we honor confidentiality and a further deep confidentiality in that way. So those are the basic principles and practices that inform the work of the Center for Courage and Renewal and Circles of Trust. So the key concepts here, I mentioned touchstones, which are some of the baseline principles or guidelines that around which we gather. We will, during the course of the week, be in a reflective rhythm. So we'll attempt to slow down and be in a rhythm of personal reflection, small group dialogue, and then large group harvesting or reflection. Open, honest questions, again, is a key practice that will characterize much of our time in dialogue together. We will invite each of us to be really present to one another in profound ways, to listen deeply, and to, as one person says, hear one another enter deeper speech. And then we'll also use third things, concepts, frameworks, readings, even poetry, to gain access into certain concepts through metaphors and stories and other kinds of ways of kind of seeing concepts at a slant. And then finally, we will use silence and pace to bend time and to, again, create a different kind of cadence that beats back against the violence of modern life and the kind of rushed pace that really disallows leaders to take that inner journey and to pay attention to what's going on inside and how that impacts their external work in the world. So that's the Courage and Renewal framework and the circles of trust approach. We will use the Courage and Renewal and circles of trust approach alongside a set of methodologies and practices that, while Courage and Renewal has a set of principles and practices for taking that inner journey, the art of hosting is a kind of complementary set of methodologies that really builds participatory leadership. And so Art of Hosting is a global community of practice that facilitates leadership development and practices through which groups gain access to a collective intelligence of a community that enables them to address issues. We often say here in my organization that we are in the midst of moments and movements and systems and organizations that are complex, that are always adapting and changing, such that we are no longer able to say that there is a smartest person in the room. But in fact, the smartest person in the room is the room itself. It's the collection of wisdom and intelligence that's in a room. And so we need practices, we need processes, we need methodologies through which we can gain access to that collective wisdom to address the complex issues that we are facing in our communities and in our organizations and movements. And so Art of Hosting involves a set of participatory leadership practices, including World Cafe, Story Harvest, Open Space, and others. And it is a part of a set of organizational development and leadership development practices that organizational theorist Jervis Bush calls dialogic organizational development practices. And let me just say a word about the difference between what dialogic organizational development is and diagnostic organizational development is. And in shorthand, dialogic practices are best employed when you have complex situations, when it's recognized that a system, a social system, or any other kind of system really needs to be transformed. So dialogic, of course, assumes a kind of relational, again, participatory set of processes that are driven by the interplay between participants, right? The assumption there in dialogic organizational development is that change occurs when the day-to-day thinking of community members alters their day-to-day decisions and actions, right? And that leads to a change in culture of a community that then entrenches those new ways of thinking. So their thinking is changed when the language and stories and narratives of a community is altered in a profound way. And dialogue-based organizational development begins to help to alter that language, alter stories, and narratives that communities use to define themselves and to define their work. On the other hand, diagnostic organizational development is really best used in situations where we really want to reform or tweak the system as it is. And so we can diagnose where smaller changes need to happen in some part of a system, in some leverage point within the system, versus thinking about the overall transformation of a system from the inside out. So that's what Art of Hosting is, and it serves as a kind of complementary set of methodologies to the Center for Courage and Renewal and the Circles of Trust. So let me say this. I've mentioned that there's a relationship between the Courage and Renewal content and the Art of Hosting practices. And I think it's important to note that those methodologies will shape the way we do our work together, right? The way we show up to one another and to ourselves. And so these principles, these practices, and participatory leadership will kind of create the container again for how we'll engage one another and the content during the week. But these won't be the only concepts and ideas that we'll be participating in and practicing. But we'll also be engaging some of the content that you've already heard on previous webinars, like collective impact and the disability, civil and human rights movements, and issues of power and privilege and leadership in systems. So there'll be other frameworks and concepts and ideas and knowledge that we'll be wrestling with alongside, or within, I should say, the container that these principles, practices, and participatory methodologies create for us. And so I think it's important to say that the principles, the practices, and the participatory leadership design, they're really there to create space for our inner work, right? That aligns and is the basis for our action as leaders in the world. Whereas our action as leaders is informed by these frameworks and concepts and language that helps us to clarify the nature of the work and the problems that we're trying to solve. And so the content in terms of collective impact and power and privilege and other kinds of ideas work alongside and in tandem with these methodologies. So finally, what will also work alongside these methodologies is a leadership self-reflection ally group. And we'll start that process on Thursday, the 28th. We'll be in groups of 4. And those will be opportunities to explore some of the leadership challenges that we're facing. And not just to explore our own challenges, but to support colleagues in their own self-reflection, to help stimulate ideas, and to help those colleagues gain some clarity around what it is that they're doing and what they may do in response to those challenges. So let's talk a little bit about the roles within these ally groups. So there are 4 roles. There's the presenter, who, and each of us will have an opportunity to be presenters, to describe our leadership challenge. There will be note takers in each group who will listen and document key elements of the challenges in the conversation. Then, of course, the ever important timekeeper, who in 15-minute segments will keep time. And then finally, the facilitator in each group, who will help to just kind of keep us on task with regard to instructions, and redirect the group as necessary. So there are a few phases for this ally group, and I just want to describe this process. So in the first phase, each presenter will describe the leadership challenge that they want to discuss in detail. And the purpose of that first phase is really just to give that presenter an opportunity to tell that story and to present that challenge. So the other group members are silent. They're not asking questions and they're not providing suggestions. They're just really witnessing what the presenter is presenting. And so the second phase is where we get to practice together in another instance of these open, honest questions that we've been practicing earlier in the week. So the three group members will then, after the first 15 minutes, practice asking open, honest questions that are designed to give that person more access to their own knowledge, essentially, and not to answer any of those questions or lead them to answers, but to give them more access to their own knowledge. So what I mean by that is one prime example of a non-open and honest question might be, have you ever thought about seeing a therapist? Right? If a person presents a problem, that is a question that actually leads a person to an answer that the person who's asking thinks is the answer. That's not the point of an open, honest question. An open, honest question might be, well, how does that feel for you, right? And that gives a person an opportunity to do a little more reflection on what's happening in that story and in their own experience. So that's the kind of question that you'll be invited to ask at that point. Then in phase 3, the three members of the group, excluding the presenter, begins to brainstorm, just popping off ideas and reflections about what they heard and also what may be possible. So this is not an advice session. It's really brainstorming around possibilities and populating in quick fashion and in generative fashion ideas and reflections. And then finally, in phase 4, the presenter, after having reflected on those open, honest questions and hearing some of that brainstorming, shares their final or current understanding of that question at that point. And hopefully that will have provided some clarity. And it could have also stoked different or a better set of questions for that person to pursue beyond that group moment. So I'll pause there. There's been a lot on the table for any questions. And after these questions, we'll review the arc of the week and the schedule for our time together. So are there any questions or observations? You can also feel free to place your questions in the chat box and we can answer them there as well. The question here is, how will we be placed into our groups of 4? Emily, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. I've got a note on saying my internet connection is spotty. So, so we first participate according to discipline, so that we have interdisciplinary groups. And so if you know of someone who participates in your discipline, likely that you will be in the same group of 4. And then after we've organized folks according to discipline, then we look diversity according to geographical region and age and race, ethnicity. We aim to have diversity within the groups, but the primary variable that we use to determine the groups is discipline. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Emily. That question came from Jennifer Eileen Castro. She says, yes, thanks. So thank you, Emily.
Matthew, are you able to see the next question?
Yeah, I see. It says, why is the circle of trust approach for us leadership? How does this impact our role as leaders in the disability field? Okay, good. Sorry, I meant, why is the circle of trust approach important? Thank you for that question. So the assumption that includes that drove the team to include the circles of trust approach is that, as I stated in the beginning, that folks who are working for change in any field, including the field of disability, are or can be benefited by an approach that, or a practice, I should say, that helps to clarify their values and helps to align their deeply held values with their action in the world, right? And so that's really what the circles of trust approach helps to do. What it does not do is it doesn't prescribe a set of ideas and commitments that people ought to be committed to. But it works across a large set of disciplines and fields, including teaching. I mentioned that it started in the field of teaching, but it operates in teaching and medicine and health and business, even religion, and across a wide set of disciplines to build the capacity of leaders to operate with integrity, particularly leaders who are interested in changing from things as they are, changing systems, organizations, societies, communities from really the state of where they are to where we hope they be towards a more hopeful future. So the Circles of Trust approach is a way of holding a dialogue in this field that enables leaders to touch in and clarify the deeply held values that drive their work. And in organizational leadership, literature, and the work in the social change and social change studies, one of the, and I'm going specifically to the work of Marshall Gans, who does work on strategic capacity and strategy. What he does is to talk about how one of the key qualities that makes a difference in the sustainability and the viability of social movements and campaigns is one's clarity about and access to one's own motivation in their work, right? And so Circles of Trust is one of those types of reflective practices and approaches that gives leaders access to that clarity over a period of time. So that's that's one answer to why the circles of trust approach can be used. And it's not for everything, but it creates a particular kind of space to do that kind of reflection. McDonald Metzger also asked, will the Academy address different leadership traits and characteristics and help us self-evaluate and reflect on our own traits? And yes, and so if I read your question correctly, McDonald, this speaks to the strengths, the VIA and the strengths work that we'll do together to reflect on our leadership traits and characteristics, and to think about that in tandem with all of these different pieces, including circles of trust and these other methodologies in the larger context of the disability rights movement. Emily, do you want to say a little word about the VIA and strengths-based leadership in response to that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matthew. You know, the webinar 2 was all about the VIA, and so I think Mark was actually going to comment that I think there's a handful of folks who still need to complete that VIA. So if you haven't completed it, go ahead and so there's six folks who still need to complete the VIA. So do that. And if you have lost the link, go ahead and email us and we'll resend you the link. And there is time on the schedule for us to process your individual VIA results, and then we'll provide guidance for how you can incorporate your individual results on the day-long leadership challenge sort of reflection day. So absolutely, this won't be a survey that's just taken and handed back to you in an envelope for you to peruse at your leisure. We'll integrate the results in time for you to reflect on those during the time that we're together.
Thank you. So we'll proceed and look at the arc of the week in light of our time. We're at 4:49. And look at the arc of the week and the general schedule for our time together. There may be one more question. Andy, is there a question you're aware of? Yes, Andy, that would be useful. So Andy asked, would it be useful to send folks the 6 foundations of trustworthy leadership? Another framework that really gets at McDonald's question, and that would, yes, that would be helpful. So thank you, Andy. Excellent. So we'll move forward and look at the arc of the week and just kind of give ourselves a sense of what we'll be doing together and how the week will flow. So this really represents the general schedule, how most of the days will go. And so you can see the rhythm of the day and how we'll operate during the course of the day. So each day at 9 a.m., there will be an optional mindfulness practice in our main room. Andy Roach and Mark Crenshaw will be present to facilitate that from 9 to 9:30. Then at 9:30, we will begin gathering and assembling in the meeting space, moving into about 9:45. And it is incredibly important that we are there right about that time to begin to settle into the space so that we can begin promptly at 10 o'clock each day with our opening circle and our morning session. Time can easily get away from us. And so to make the best use of our time and making sure that we end well, that means we have to start well. So getting there at around 9:30, assembling, beginning to have some morning conversations, or just to be present in the space will be important, so we can get started right there at 10 o'clock. We'll have our morning session for that 2-hour block from 10 to 12. Lunch each day will be about 90 minutes, followed by an afternoon session, a 3-hour afternoon session from 1:30 to 4:30. And at that time, we'll move into our open space moment. An open space will be introduced, but it's a practice in which we're able to host and hold the conversations that some of which pop up during the course of our gathering that weren't prescribed, but we really want to make sure we have those conversations before we leave. And so we want to create a little space, right? A little open space for folks to be able to host the conversations that need to be had at a particular moment. We end each day right at 5:30 with our closing circle, which will include a preview of the following day. And then we end with dinner each day at 6 p.m. So that's the general arc of each day. And now to the arc of the week. So let's start with Sunday. We begin on Sunday afternoon with our opening circle. And well, first with our introduction to the Leadership Academy. We will gather at 3 and begin at 4. We'll gather at 3, registration, kind of settling in. We'll begin at 4 with our introductions, and then host our opening circle as a part of that 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock block, followed by dinner at 6. That's Sunday to get us started. Then on Monday, right there at 10 o'clock, we'll begin with an exercise that gets us into a mode of storytelling, which is called Exploring Our Inner Landmarks of Leadership. And you'll see that storytelling, we are practicing the practice of storytelling as a leadership practice, as a leadership discipline. So we'll begin with our personal stories that morning. Our guest speaker over lunch that day will be Mark Johnson, veteran in the disability rights movement, the director of advocacy at the Shepherd Center, the founder of ADAPT. He will be with us over lunch just before we visit the National Center for Civil and Human Rights at right here in Atlanta. And we'll visit for a couple of hours, and then we'll return to our headquarters to reflect together on what we experienced, what we've learned, and what new insights may be emerging for us. So that will be Monday, where we'll have a little bit of an outing. On Tuesday, we move into 3 concepts that we'll explore together. First is with Dr. Carleen DeBlair, leading us in exploring power and privilege on the heels, of course, of our visit to the Center for Civil and Human Rights. McDonald, in response to your question, we'll spend some time that afternoon looking at strengths-based leadership, again, looking at our attributes and qualities and how they impact our approach to leadership. And then we'll also deal with collective impact that will be led by Dan Crimmins. That's our Tuesday. Then on Wednesday, we'll build on that inner landmarks exercise in a process called collective story harvest. And so there's a way in which our personal stories, again, begin to reflect larger themes that we as communities of leaders are dealing with. And collective story harvest is a methodology from the art of hosting set of practices that helps us to begin to do that. And we'll spend that afternoon with a couple of veterans in this work, Olivia Rayner and Zoe Stoneman, they'll be interviewed, and after which we'll look at a framework for thinking about change in complex systems called the Two Loops model for social change that comes out of the Berkana Institute, specifically designed by Margaret Wheatley and Deborah Fries, two organizational theorists. So that's what Wednesday looks like. We take a kind of, whereas Tuesday we're looking at, for the most part, our kind of personal strengths and issues of power and privilege. Wednesday begins to widen the lens a bit to look at broader themes in connection with our colleagues in larger complex systems. Thursday will be the process that I described a bit earlier, the self-reflection ally groups, that 4-phased process in small groups. And that will really take the entirety of the day. And we'll go slowly, but steadily, of course, through that process so that everyone has an opportunity to present that challenge, but also to support one another in exploring their challenges. And that will be followed by a party that evening, a celebration right there in the law school on the upper level, where we'll get to celebrate the rich time that we will have had together. And then on Friday, we'll have our closing circle in which we will really think about what are our next steps and begin to set our intentions for the work that we have to do going back to our places of leadership and service. And then we'll have our closing circle that will bring our time to an end. So that will be the arc of the week, with a lot of details, of course, that are not listed, but that will be a part of our process together. So in preparation for that week, here are some next steps for you. And here's what we want to invite you to bring. First, for our leadership symbol, for our opening session, I should say, we want to invite you to bring a leadership symbol. And that is an object, an image, some artifact that symbolizes the deeply held values that drive your work in the disability rights movement. So again, it could be a picture, it could be some object, some token that symbolizes your leadership and the values that ground it, right? And we'll ask you to bring that with you when you arrive on Sunday at 3 o'clock. Next, over the next couple of weeks, we want you to think about 1 to 2 leadership challenges that you're experiencing. And those leadership challenges, those 1 or 2 challenges will be what you want to present as a part of your leadership ally groups. Now, let me warn you, there have been times, and what we experienced last year was that some folks came with a leadership challenge that when they got there recognized this isn't the challenge that I really want to deal with. There's something that's a little more pressing and maybe even more intimate that I want to share with this group that I trust them to deal with. And so come prepared to share, but also be prepared that what you came prepared with may change over the course of the week, given what insights come up for you. So come with the leadership challenge. And then finally, there will be a significant amount of personal reflection. And so we recommend writing materials, but you may also bring recording materials or whatever you need to do the kind of reflection that you may need to do during the course of the week. We want to invite you to bring materials to enable you to do that. So that's next steps, preliminary next steps heading into our time together at the end of the month. So again, we check in and we begin networking Sunday. So plan to be there at 3 so we can kind of get settled, make one another's acquaintance, and we'll begin promptly with the opening session at 4 o'clock there on the lower level of the Georgia State University Law School building. You see the location there and the address, Knowles Conference Center, 85 Park Place, Atlanta, Georgia, 30303. And we'll look forward to seeing you there. Are there any final questions? I know we're a couple minutes past 5. We want to make sure we address any final questions. Betsy Humphreys asked, will you be sending out the slides from the 4 intro webinars? Andy or Mark, do you want to address that?
Hi, this is Emily. And yes, absolutely. So not only will the slides be available to you electronically, we'll have paper copies of them for you in your binders when you arrive the week of.
Thank you, Emily. Are there any other final questions?
So, Matthew, can I just add to, I noticed that you had this is Mark, and I noticed that you, in the webinar, gave them some homework to do. We'll be sending out sort of brief, like 2-page synopses of kind of the major concepts that we'll cover during the week, and it's essentially meant to be reading you can do on the airplane, and there's specific attention paid to accessibility of that, and so it's really trying to boil the concepts down into really accessible, digestible pieces. And so you'll also be receiving that at the beginning of next week.
Thank you, Mark. So it looks like we are at time. And so I want to say thank you for your presence and participation in this webinar. I'm looking forward to meeting each of you in person, and I'm looking forward to this experience that we'll have together at the end of the month. Thank you so much. Are there any final words, Mark or Emily or Andy, that we want to offer?
I would just echo, this is Mark, and I would just echo, Matthew, what you said. We're now that we have hosted the webinars, and you'll be getting some final bits of information from us, we're just really excited to host you in Atlanta in a couple weeks. Please know that if you have questions or concerns in advance of your travel to Atlanta, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be glad to support your presence and participation in whatever ways we can.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Take care, everyone. We'll see you in Atlanta.